The December rain fell in sheets across downtown Seattle, turning the bustling Pike Place market into a blur of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Most people ducked into coffee shops or pressed themselves against storefront windows, waiting for the storm to pass. But Marcus Chen had nowhere to hide. Oh, where? He stood at the corner of First and Pine, his 8-year-old daughter Emma clinging to his hand, both of them soaked to the bone despite the thin jacket they shared between them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The interview had gone well, he thought, maybe even great. The construction foreman had nodded approvingly when Marcus explained his experience with electrical work, had even mentioned something about starting Monday if the background check came through clean. But that was 3 hours ago. And now, the sky had opened up with the kind of November downpour that seemed to wash hope right out of the air. Emma sneezed, a small, wet sound that cut through Marcus like a blade. She'd been fighting a cold for days, and here he was, dragging her through. The rain, because he couldn't afford a babysitter and had no one else to call. Her school clothes were damp, her sneakers squelched with each step, and her backpack hung heavy with soggy homework she'd probably have to redo. He pulled her closer, trying to shield her with his body as they waited for the bus that should have arrived 20 minutes ago. That's when he saw her. A woman in an expensive-looking cream coat, stumbling slightly as she tried to navigate the slick sidewalk in heels that were clearly not meant for Seattle weather. She was maybe in her 30s, with dark hair that was rapidly losing its careful styling to the rain, and she clutched a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, back when he was making anything at all. She looked lost, checking her phone repeatedly, her face growing more panicked with each glance at the screen. Without thinking, Marcus shrugged out of his jacket. It wasn't much, just a worn navy windbreaker he'd picked up at Goodwill 2 years ago, but it was all he had. He approached her carefully, Emma still attached to his side like a small shivering shadow. "Excuse me," he called out, having to raise his voice over the rain. "You look like you could use this more than I do." The woman turned, startled. Up close, Marcus could see she was younger than he'd first thought, with green eyes that were wide with something that looked like genuine fear. Her makeup was starting to run, and she was shaking, though whether from cold or something else, he couldn't tell. "I couldn't," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "You have a child." "And you're about to catch pneumonia in that coat," Marcus replied, holding out his jacket. "It's not much, but it's waterproof. Well, mostly." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out his angle. People probably didn't do things like this in her world, Marcus realized. Everything likely came with strings attached, with expectations and hidden costs. But sometimes when you've been at the bottom long enough, you remember what it feels like to need help from a stranger. "Take it," he said gently. "Please. My daughter would never forgive me if I let a lady stand in the rain." Emma looked up at the woman and nodded solemnly. At 8, she had already learned to recognize when someone was struggling, probably because she'd seen enough of it herself. The woman's expression softened as she looked at the little girl, and finally she accepted the jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it on. It was too big for her, hanging loose around her shoulders, but it was dry and warm. "I don't know how to repay you." "Don't worry about it," Marcus said, already turning away. The bus was finally approaching, its headlights cutting through the rain like beacons. "Just pay it forward someday." Marcus had been out of work for 4 months. 4 months since the construction company he'd worked for had folded overnight, taking his steady paycheck and his health insurance with it. 4 months of sending out resumes that disappeared into digital voids, of showing up to job sites only to be told they'd already filled the position, of watching his savings account dwindle to nothing while the bills kept coming with relentless regularity. The apartment they shared was a one-bedroom in Capitol Hill that had seemed manageable when he was working 40 hours a week plus overtime. Now, it felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, even though the walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez arguing with her husband next door, and the heat only worked sporadically. Emma slept on the pull-out couch in the living room, and Marcus had converted the bedroom into a combination office workshop where he tried to fix electronics and small appliances for neighbors who paid him in cash or homemade meals. It wasn't the life he'd planned. When Sarah had died 3 years ago, victim of a drunk driver on I-5, Marcus had thought the worst was behind them. He'd thought that nothing could be harder than explaining to a 5-year-old why mommy wasn't coming home, why the house suddenly felt too big and too quiet, why daddy cried when he thought she wasn't looking. But grief, he'd learned, was just the first challenge. Everything that came after, the practical day-to-day business of being a single parent with no family nearby and no safety net, that was where the real test lay. Emma was resilient in the way that only children can be. She adapted to their reduced circumstances with a pragmatism that sometimes broke Marcus's heart. She never complained when dinner was mac and cheese for the 3rd night in a row, never asked why they couldn't go to the movies anymore, or why her friends had birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, while hers was celebrated with a cupcake from the grocery store bakery. She helped sort the laundry and fold the clothes, stood on a step stool to help wash dishes, and did her homework at the kitchen table while Marcus worked on whatever repair job he'd managed to pick up that day. The rain had started early that morning, and Marcus had almost cancelled the interview. Emma's cold was getting worse, and he hated the idea of dragging her out in the weather. But this job was different. This was a union position with benefits, steady hours, and the kind of pay that might actually let them move to a 2-bedroom apartment, maybe even start saving for Emma's college fund again. So he'd bundled her up in her warmest clothes, packed extra tissues and cough drops, and they'd made their way downtown on the bus. The interview had been at a construction site for a new office building, and Marcus had arrived early, shaking, hands firmly with the foreman, and answering questions about his experience with confidence he didn't entirely feel. He'd worked construction for 12 years before Emma was born, then transitioned to facilities management for a tech company. Because the hours were more predictable. When Sarah got sick, he'd needed the flexibility, the insurance, the ability to take time off for doctor's appointments and treatments. After she died, he'd stayed in that job for stability, for Emma's sake. But when the company went under, he'd been forced back into construction, back to the irregular hours and physical demands he'd thought he'd left behind. The foreman had seemed impressed with Marcus's resume, his references, his willingness to start immediately. They'd talked about the project timeline, the crew he'd be working with, the possibility of advancement if he proved himself reliable. It had gone well enough that Marcus allowed himself to hope, to imagine telling Emma that they could finally stop worrying about next month's rent, that maybe they could even get her a proper bed instead of the pull-out couch. But hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed as many times as Marcus had, so he tried to temper his optimism with realism as they waited for the bus home. The background check would take a few days, the foreman had said. They'd call by Friday with an answer. That gave Marcus 3 more days of uncertainty, 3 more days of checking the bank balance and counting out grocery money in singles and a change. Emma had been patient during the interview, sitting quietly in the trailer office while Marcus talked with the foreman, coloring in a notebook he'd brought for her and occasionally looking up to smile at the secretary who'd given her a piece of candy. But now she was tired and cold and fighting off illness, and Marcus could see her energy flagging as they stood in the rain. The woman he'd given his jacket to had disappeared into the crowd, probably into one of the upscale boutiques or art galleries that lined the street. Marcus didn't think about her again until they were finally on the bus, Emma curled against his side, with her head on his shoulder, both of them shivering in their wet clothes. The heater on the bus wasn't working properly, and Marcus rubbed Emma's arms, trying to warm her up. "Daddy," she said quietly, her voice thick with congestion, "are you cold without your jacket?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," he lied, "because that's what fathers do. Just a little rain never hurt anybody." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why did you give it to that lady?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. Emma was at an age where she noticed everything, where his actions were teaching her lessons he might not even be aware of giving. "Because she needed it more than I did," he said finally. "And because sometimes, when we help other people, things come back to us. Not right away, maybe, but eventually." "Like karma?" Emma asked. She'd learned the word from a friend at school, though Marcus wasn't sure she fully understood what it meant. "Something like that," he agreed. "More like doing the right thing because it's right, not because you expect something in return." Emma nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and closed her eyes. Marcus watched the city blur past through. The rain-streaked windows, apartment buildings and strip malls and coffee shops, all of it familiar and foreign at the same time. He'd lived in Seattle his whole life, but lately it felt like a different city, one where he didn't quite belong, where he was always scrambling to keep up with the rising cost of everything while his own opportunities seemed to shrink. They got off the bus 6 blocks from their apartment, and by the time they climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their door, Emma was coughing again. Marcus made her a cup of hot chocolate with the last of the cocoa mix and ran a hot bath, letting her soak while he changed into dry clothes and tried to figure out what to make for dinner. The refrigerator was depressingly empty. A carton of milk that would expire tomorrow, half a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, and a package of hot dogs that had been on sale for 99 cents. It would have to be hot dogs and toast again. Marcus made a mental note to stop by the food bank tomorrow if Emma was feeling better. He hated the idea of it, hated the admission of need it represented, but pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. Emma needed to eat, needed proper nutrition to fight off her cold and grow strong. His own comfort mattered less than her health and well-being. While Emma soaked in the tub, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through job listings and updating his resume for what felt like the 100th time. He'd applied for everything from security guard positions to delivery driver jobs, anything that might provide steady income and flexible hours. The construction job was his best prospect, but he'd learned not to count on anything until the check was actually in his hand. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister in Portland. "How's the job hunt going? Let me know if you need anything." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but Linda had her own family to worry about, her own mortgage and car payments and kids' activities. He'd borrowed money from her twice in the past year, small amounts that he'd paid back as soon as he could, but he couldn't keep asking for help. At some point, he had to figure this out on his own. Emma emerged from the bathroom in her pajamas, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed from the hot water. She looked better, less pale, though she was still coughing. Marcus made her a simple dinner, and they ate together at the small table, talking about her day at school, her friends, the book she was reading for her class project. She was bright and curious and funny, this little person who had become the center of his universe, and listening to her chatter about her teacher and her classmates reminded Marcus why he was fighting so hard to keep their life stable. After dinner, they curled up on the couch together to watch a movie on his laptop, Emma's head heavy against his chest as she dozed. Marcus stroked her hair and thought about the woman in the rain, wondered if she'd made it to wherever she was. Going, if his jacket had helped her stay warm and dry. He'd probably never see it again, and that was fine. It hadn't been much of a jacket anyway, thin and worn and missing a button. But it had been his, and he'd given it freely, without expectation of return. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That was something, at least. In a world that seemed increasingly transactional, where every kindness came with a price tag and every favor demanded reciprocation, Marcus had managed to do something purely generous. It wouldn't pay his rent or put food on the table, but it reminded him that he was still the kind of person who would give a stranger his coat in the rain. That mattered more than he could articulate, even to himself. As Emma fell asleep in his arms, Marcus thought about tomorrow, about the phone call that might or might not come, about the bills that were due next week and the ones that were already overdue. He thought about the woman in the expensive coat and the cream-colored jacket that now belonged to her, carrying with it a small piece of his own story, his own struggle, his own determination to keep moving forward, despite everything trying to hold him back. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and filling the gutters with rushing water that would eventually find its way to the Sound. Somewhere in the city, people were making decisions that would change lives, including his own, though he wouldn't know it for days yet. For now, there was just this moment. A father and daughter safe and warm in their small apartment, tomorrow's worries held at bay by the simple act of being together, being alive, being grateful for what they had instead of bitter about what they'd lost. The call came on a Thursday morning while Marcus was fixing Mrs. Rodriguez's blender. Emma had finally shaken her cold and was back at school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she walked to the bus stop with renewed energy. Marcus had been grateful for the quiet, for the chance to focus on the delicate work of rewiring the motor without small fingers trying to help or worried questions about whether he was being careful with the sharp tools. His phone rang just as he was testing the repaired connection, and he almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or robocalls, neither of which would improve his morning. But something made him wipe his hands on his jeans and swipe the screen. Marcus Chen. The voice was gruff, but not unkind, and Marcus recognized it immediately as belonging to Bill Patterson, the construction foreman. "Yes, sir, this is Marcus." "Well, son, I've got some good news for you. Background check came back clean, references all checked out solid. You still interested in starting Monday?" Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. He sank into the nearest chair, one hand pressed to his forehead as if he could hold the moment steady through sheer force of will. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Patterson. You won't regret this. 7 a.m. sharp, and don't forget your hard hat. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." After he hung up, Marcus sat in the silence of his small apartment for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. Steady work, health insurance, a paycheck that would cover rent and groceries and maybe even let him put a little aside for Emma's future. It felt almost too good to be true, and part of him waited for the other shoe to drop, for some catch or complication that would snatch this opportunity away. But the days passed without catastrophe. Monday arrived crisp and clear, and Marcus showed up to the construction site with his tool belt and his hard hat, ready to prove himself all over again. The work was exactly what he'd expected. Long hours, physical demands, the kind of job that left him bone-tired but satisfied at the end of each day. The crew was a mix of veterans and newcomers, men who'd been swinging hammers for decades alongside younger workers trying to learn the trade. Marcus found his place somewhere in the middle, experienced enough to be trusted with complex tasks, but humble enough to listen when the old-timers shared their wisdom. Emma adjusted to the new routine with the resilience that continued to amaze him. She walked herself to the bus stop each morning, letting Marcus leave for work earlier, and she'd set up a small homework station at the kitchen table where she could work independently until he got home. Mrs. Rodriguez had offered to keep an eye on her after school, a kindness that Marcus accepted gratefully, though he insisted on paying her what little he could afford. The first paycheck was a revelation. Marcus had almost forgotten what it felt like to deposit money instead of checking his balance with dread, to walk into a grocery store and focus on nutrition instead of just calories per dollar. He bought Emma new shoes, proper winter boots, that would keep her feet dry, and a warm coat to replace the thin jacket she'd been wearing. For himself, he allowed the luxury of a decent lunch instead of the peanut butter sandwiches he'd been packing, and he even splurged on a newspaper subscription so he could stay current with local news. But the real change wasn't financial. Though the steady income certainly helped, it was the return of routine, of purpose, of the quiet dignity that came from honest work honestly performed. Marcus had always been good with his hands, whether he was framing walls or rewiring electrical systems, and being back on a job site reminded him of skills he'd thought might be getting rusty. He found himself volunteering for the more challenging assignments, staying late when necessary, building the kind of reputation that led to steady work and supervisor roles. The other men on the crew began to include him in their conversations, their after-work plans, their easy camaraderie. Marcus was careful not to get too caught up in the social aspects of the job. He needed to get home to Emma, and he couldn't afford to spend money on drinks or dinners out, but it felt good to be part of something again, to have colleagues who respected his work and trusted his judgment. 3 weeks into the job, Marcus was working on the electrical system for the building's main conference room when he overheard a conversation that made his hands still on the wire strippers. Two of the project managers were discussing the building's future tenant, a fashion company that was apparently investing heavily in the space. "I heard they're putting in some kind of design studio on the top floor," one of them said. "Expensive stuff. The owner's supposedly some hotshot who made it big in New York and decided to expand to Seattle." "Must be nice," the other replied, "having that kind of money to throw around." Marcus didn't think much about it at the time. The fashion industry was as foreign to him as space travel, and he was more concerned with making sure the electrical work met code than with whatever business would eventually occupy the building. But something about the conversation nagged at him as he worked, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. That evening, Emma was unusually chatty over dinner, full of stories about her day at school and excited about a project she was working on for her social studies class. She'd been assigned to interview someone who had overcome challenges in their life, and she'd decided to interview Marcus. "Tell me about when you were little," she said. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What did you want to be when you grew up?" Marcus smiled, remembering conversations like this with his own father, though they'd been rarer and usually centered around practical concerns like grades and chores. "I wanted to be an architect," he said. "I used to draw buildings and bridges, imagine designing skyscrapers that would last forever." "Why didn't you?" Emma asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "Life happened," Marcus said, then realized that wasn't really an answer. "I needed to start working right after high school to help support my family. Construction paid well, and I was good at it. Architecture required college, and college cost money we didn't have." Emma nodded solemnly, as if filing this information away for future reference. "Do you miss it? Drawing buildings?" Marcus considered the question. He'd put away his sketch pads years ago, convinced that dreaming about things he couldn't have was a waste of time better spent on practical concerns. But sometimes, when he was working on a particularly challenging structural problem, he could feel that old creative spark, the satisfaction of figuring out how pieces fit together to create something larger than themselves. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I like what I do now too. Building things with my hands, seeing a project come together from nothing. It's different from designing, but it's still creating something." "Maybe you could draw again," Emma suggested, "just for fun." That weekend, Marcus found himself in the art supply section of the drugstore, looking at sketch pads and pencils with the kind of longing he usually reserved for things completely out of reach. He ended up buying a small pad and a set of basic pencils, telling himself it was for Emma if she wanted to draw, but knowing he was really buying them for himself. Saturday evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the sketch pad open in front of him. He started with simple shapes, geometric forms that gradually became more complex as his hand remembered movements it hadn't made in years. Then, almost without conscious thought, he began drawing the building he was working on, trying to capture not just its structure but its potential, the way it would look when it was finished and filled with people pursuing their dreams. The drawing wasn't perfect. His perspective was a little off, and some of the proportions weren't quite right, but there was something in it that pleased him, a sense of possibility that he'd almost forgotten he could feel. He tore the page from the pad and tacked it to the refrigerator where Emma would see it in the morning. As winter settled over Seattle, Marcus found his rhythm. Work was steady and satisfying. Emma was thriving in school, and they'd managed to build a small cushion in their savings account, enough to handle minor emergencies without panic. The apartment still wasn't much to look at, but it felt more like home now that financial stress wasn't quite so crushing. Marcus had even been able to buy Emma a few books she'd been wanting, and he'd started a small college fund with automatic deposits that would grow slowly but steadily over the years. The building project was progressing ahead of schedule, and Marcus had been promoted to crew leader for the electrical team, a recognition of both his technical skills and his ability to work well with others. The promotion came with a modest raise and the promise of steady work on future projects, assuming the current job continued to go smoothly. It was during this period of relative stability that Marcus began to notice the packages. They started small, inconspicuous deliveries that appeared at their apartment door without explanation. The first was a bag of groceries from a local organic market, far more expensive than anything Marcus would have purchased for himself. He assumed it was a mistake, some mix-up with apartment numbers, and he was preparing to return it when Emma pointed out that his name was clearly written on the delivery receipt. The second package contained winter clothes for Emma, high quality, items from brands Marcus recognized but had never been able to afford. A warm sweater, thermal underwear, a hat and glove set that looked both practical and stylish. Again, his name was on the delivery slip, but there was no return address, no indication of who might have sent them. Marcus called the store, thinking there might be some record of the purchase, but the customer service representative could only tell him that the order had been placed online and paid for with a credit card. The billing information was blocked for privacy, and there was nothing else they could share. Maybe it's a secret admirer, Emma suggested, when Marcus expressed his confusion over dinner. Like in the movies. Secret admirers don't usually send groceries and winter clothes to single fathers, Marcus replied, though he was touched by her romanticism. More likely it's some kind of charity program, or maybe a mix-up that will sort itself out eventually. But the packages kept coming, always containing exactly what they needed at exactly the right time. When Emma's shoes began to show wear, new ones appeared. When Marcus's winter coat finally gave up the ghost, a replacement arrived that fit perfectly and was warm enough for the worst Seattle weather. When Emma mentioned that her friends at school had tablets for their homework, a child-friendly device showed up with educational software already installed. Each delivery was accompanied by a small card with a simple message: for those who give without expecting return, or kindness deserves kindness, or some gifts are meant to be passed forward. The handwriting was elegant, clearly feminine, but Marcus couldn't place it or figure out any connection to someone he might know. The mystery might have bothered him more if the gifts hadn't been so thoughtful, so perfectly matched to their actual needs, rather than expensive luxuries they couldn't use. Whoever was sending these things understood their situation intimately, knew exactly what would make the biggest difference in their daily lives. It was both comforting and slightly unsettling, this sense of being watched over by someone who remained invisible. Marcus tried to investigate, asking around the neighborhood and even checking with Mrs. Rodriguez to see if she'd noticed anyone making deliveries, but the packages always appeared when they were away from home, and no one seemed to have seen anything unusual. The delivery drivers, when Marcus managed to catch them, always claimed to have simply been given an address and told to leave the packages at the door. As Christmas approached, Marcus found himself in the unfamiliar position of having enough money to buy Emma proper presents, not just the single small gift he'd managed in previous years. He started shopping early, taking advantage of sales and comparing prices with the kind of careful attention he'd always applied to necessary purchases, but had never been able to use for wants instead of needs. Emma had been hinting about a bicycle, something she'd outgrown years ago, but they'd never been able to replace. Marcus found a good used one at a shop that refurbished donated bikes for low-income families, and he spent several evenings in the apartment building's basement workshop, cleaning and adjusting it until it looked nearly new. He also bought her art supplies inspired by his own return to drawing and several books from her favorite series. The night before Christmas Eve, Marcus was wrapping Emma's presents at the kitchen table when there was a soft knock at their door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors usually meant problems. But when he opened the door, he found only a large box with his name on it and a card that read, "For the man who gives his coat to strangers." Inside the box was a new winter jacket, clearly expensive but practical rather than flashy. It was exactly his size and style, the kind of coat he would have chosen for himself if money had been no object. Underneath the jacket was an envelope containing a gift certificate to a local restaurant, enough for a nice dinner for two. Marcus stared at the items for a long time, his mind racing through possibilities. The reference to giving his coat to strangers was too specific to be coincidental. Someone had seen what happened that rainy day outside Pike Place Market, had remembered it, had been watching them ever since. But who? And why? He thought about the woman in the cream-colored coat, the one who had accepted his windbreaker with such gratitude and surprise. Could she be behind the gifts? It seemed impossible, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. She'd been well-dressed, clearly wealthy, exactly the kind of person who might have the resources to help a struggling family anonymously. But even if she was the mysterious benefactor, Marcus couldn't understand her motivation. He'd given her his jacket impulsively, without thought of reward or recognition. It had been a simple act of human kindness, the sort of thing anyone might do in similar circumstances. Why would it warrant months of anonymous generosity? Emma found him still sitting at the table when she woke up early Christmas morning, the jacket draped across his lap and the gift certificate in his hands. She took one look at the items and grinned. "Your secret admirer strikes again," she said, climbing into his lap. "This is a really nice coat, Daddy. Way nicer than your old one." Marcus hugged her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and marveling at how much his life had changed in just a few months. He had steady work, a healthy daughter, a warm apartment, and apparently a guardian angel he'd never met, but who seemed determined to ensure they had everything they needed to thrive. "You know what?" he said, looking down at Emma's bright, curious face. "I think we should use this gift certificate tonight. Just the two of us, a fancy dinner to celebrate Christmas." "Can I wear my new dress?" Emma asked, referring to one of the mysterious packages that had contained several outfits in her exact size. "Absolutely," Marcus said. "We'll both dress up and have a proper celebration." As they prepared for their Christmas dinner, Marcus found himself wondering not just about the identity of their benefactor, but about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A simple act of kindness on a rainy day had somehow transformed their lives in ways he was still discovering. It reminded him of something his father had told him years ago, that goodness had a way of multiplying when you least expected it, that the smallest gestures could create ripples that spread far beyond their original impact. That evening, as he watched Emma carefully cut her steak at the restaurant, her face glowing with excitement at being somewhere so fancy, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude that went beyond the material gifts they'd received. Someone had seen worth in him, had recognized something in that moment of giving that deserved nurturing and support. It was a gift more valuable than any coat or dinner, the knowledge that his actions mattered, that the kind of man he was trying to be was worth becoming. Outside the restaurant windows, Seattle sparkled with holiday lights, and Marcus Chen allowed himself to believe that the new year would bring even more reasons to hope, even more opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust someone had placed in him. The mysterious benefactor had given him more than gifts. She had given him back his faith in the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. That kindness was never wasted, that sometimes the universe found ways to balance the scales for those who tried to do right, even when no one was watching. Spring arrived in Seattle with the kind of tentative warmth that made everyone remember why they lived in the Pacific Northwest, despite the months of rain. Marcus had been working on the downtown construction project for 6 months now, and the building was beginning to take its final shape. What had started as concrete foundations and steel beams was becoming something recognizable, something that would soon house the dreams and ambitions of whatever company had commissioned its construction. The electrical work was nearly complete, and Marcus had earned a reputation among the crew as someone who could solve problems that stumped others. Just last week, he'd figured out a wiring issue that had been causing delays for days, tracing the problem through multiple junction boxes until he found a mislabeled circuit that was causing interference. His supervisor had praised him publicly at the morning briefing, and several of the other crew leaders had started coming to him when they encountered technical difficulties. It was a good feeling, being recognized for his expertise rather than just his willingness to work hard. Marcus had always been competent at his job, but this project was allowing him to demonstrate skills he'd developed over the years, but hadn't always had the opportunity to showcase. He was solving complex problems, training newer workers, and contributing to the project in ways that went beyond simply following instructions. Emma was thriving too. Her grades had improved dramatically since Marcus started working steadily, not because he was helping her more with homework, but because the stress level in their household had decreased so significantly. She was sleeping better, eating better, and approaching her schoolwork with the kind of confidence that came from knowing her basic needs were secure. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had even mentioned at the last parent conference that Emma seemed like a different child from the one who had started the school year. The mysterious gifts had continued throughout the winter and into spring, though they'd become less frequent and more targeted. Instead of regular deliveries of necessities, Marcus now found himself receiving things that spoke to interests he'd barely acknowledged he still had. A set of professional drafting tools appeared one day, followed by a subscription to an architecture magazine he'd mentioned wanting to read years ago. When Emma expressed interest in learning to play piano, a small keyboard showed up with beginner lesson books. Marcus had stopped trying to figure out who was behind the gifts. The mystery was part of their lives now, accepted rather than questioned. Emma had dubbed their unknown benefactor the fairy godmother, and Marcus had to admit the name fit better than he'd expected. Like something from a children's story, this person seemed to appear exactly when needed, providing exactly what would make the biggest difference, then disappearing back into whatever world they normally inhabited. The construction project was scheduled to be completed by the end of summer, and Marcus had been offered a position on the crew's next job, a residential development in Bellevue that would keep him employed for at least another year. It was exactly the kind of job security he'd been hoping for, the foundation on which he could build a stable future for Emma. But lately, he'd been finding himself drawn back to those sketches he'd started making at the kitchen table, imagining, not just building other people's designs, but creating his own. The idea was impractical, of course. Going back to school for architecture would mean years of study he couldn't afford, both financially and in terms of time away from Emma. But the seed had been planted, and Marcus found himself researching programs anyway, looking at community college courses that might be a starting point, wondering if there might be a way to pursue his old dream without sacrificing his daughter's security. It was during one of his lunch breaks, as he sat on a stack of lumber sketching ideas for a small house design, that one of the project managers approached him. Tom Wilson was a guy Marcus had worked with on several occasions, someone who seemed to notice when people went above and beyond their basic job requirements. "That's some nice work," Tom said, looking over Marcus's shoulder at the sketch. "You do this professionally?" Marcus shook his head, embarrassed to be caught drawing during work time. "Just a hobby. Something I used to do when I was younger." "Mind if I take a look?" Tom asked, and Marcus handed over the sketch pad, reluctantly. Tom flipped through several pages, studying each drawing with the kind of attention that suggested he knew what he was looking at. "This is really good stuff. You ever think about doing this for real?" "Not really practical for me," Marcus replied. "I've got responsibilities that don't leave much room for career changes." Tom nodded understanding. "I get that. But you might be interested to know that the company moving into this building is looking for someone with construction experience who also has design skills. They're planning to do a lot of custom work, and they need someone who understands both sides of the process." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "What kind of company?" "Fashion design, I think. High-end stuff. They're putting in studios and workshops, want someone who can help them design spaces that are both functional and beautiful. Pays well, too, from what I've heard." The conversation stayed with Marcus for the rest of the day. He tried to tell himself it was just idle curiosity, that he couldn't seriously consider leaving construction for something as uncertain as design work. But that evening, he found himself researching the fashion industry, trying to understand what kind of skills might be valuable to a company that made clothing. What he discovered surprised him. Fashion design wasn't just about creativity and aesthetics. Though those were certainly important, it was also about understanding materials and construction techniques, about solving practical problems related to fit and function, about managing complex production processes that required both technical knowledge and artistic vision. In many ways, it wasn't so different from construction, except that instead of building spaces for people to live and work in, fashion designers built clothes for people to wear and feel confident in. Emma noticed his preoccupation over dinner. "You're thinking really hard about something," she observed, with the directness that always caught him off guard. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Marcus assured her. "Just thinking about work stuff. Someone mentioned a job opportunity that might be interesting." "A different job?" Emma asked, and Marcus could hear the worry in her voice. Change had often meant instability in their lives, and she'd learned to be cautious about anything that might disrupt their newfound security. "Maybe," Marcus said. "It's probably nothing, but it would involve drawing and designing things, kind of like what I've been doing at the kitchen table." Emma's face lit up. "You mean like being an architect?" "Something like that," Marcus replied, "but it's just an idea. I'd have to learn a lot more about it before I could even apply." "You should try," Emma said with the kind of absolute certainty that only children possess. "You're really good at drawing, and you're always figuring out how to fix things and make them better. Maybe this is like that, but with clothes instead of buildings." Her faith in him was both touching and terrifying. Marcus had gotten comfortable with the idea of steady construction work, of building someone else's designs rather than creating his own. The thought of putting himself out there, of risking rejection or failure, was daunting. But Emma's confidence reminded him that he'd taken risks before and survived them, that sometimes the scariest choices led to the best outcomes. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began quietly researching the fashion company that would be occupying the building he was helping to complete. Avalon Studios, according to the business licenses and permit applications he could access through public records, was owned by someone named Isabella Rivera. The company had started in New York, but was expanding to Seattle, apparently drawn by the city's growing reputation as a hub for sustainable and innovative design. Marcus tried to find more information about Isabella Rivera, but she seemed to maintain a remarkably low public profile for someone successful enough to commission a custom building. There were a few mentions in trade publications, some references to her work with sustainable materials and ethical manufacturing practices, but no photos or personal details. It was as if she'd deliberately chosen to let her work speak for itself, rather than building a personal brand around her success. The more Marcus learned about Avalon Studios, the more intrigued he became. This wasn't fast fashion or mass production, but something closer to what he imagined architecture might be like. Custom work designed to last, created with attention to both function and beauty, built to serve specific needs rather than generic market demands. It was the kind of work that might actually use his construction background, as well as his design interests, the perfect combination of practical skills and creative vision. When Tom Wilson mentioned that Avalon Studios was starting to interview for their facilities and design coordinator position, Marcus almost didn't respond. The job description seemed too good to be true, too perfectly matched to his unusual combination of skills and interests. But Emma had been asking about his drawing job every day, and her enthusiasm was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus spent a weekend putting together a portfolio of his sketches, including both the architectural drawings he'd been working on and some attempts at designing functional clothing based on his construction experience. He wasn't sure if any of it was good enough for a professional design company, but it represented his best work, his most honest attempt to combine his practical knowledge with his creative aspirations. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus took a half-day off from the construction site to attend. He'd been nervous about the meeting all week, but as he walked into the partially completed building where Avalon Studios would soon be operating, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. He'd helped wire the electrical systems for these rooms, had watched them take shape from empty concrete shells into spaces that would soon house creative work. The woman who greeted him in the temporary office was not what he'd expected. Isabella Rivera was younger than he'd imagined, probably in her early 30s, with an understated elegance that spoke of success without ostentation. She was wearing what looked like her own designs, clothes that were clearly expensive but practical, beautiful without being impractical. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus's attention, green eyes that seemed familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Chen," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming in. I've been looking forward to meeting you." As they shook hands, Marcus felt a jolt of recognition. There was something about her voice, her manner, that triggered a memory he couldn't quite access. But before he could pursue the thought, Isabella was leading him toward a conference table where his portfolio lay open, several of his sketches spread out for examination. "These are really impressive," she said, studying his drawings with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite courtesy. "You have a real understanding of how structure relates to function, which is exactly what we need for this position." The interview lasted almost 2 hours, far longer than Marcus had expected. They discussed his construction background, his design interests, his ideas about how clothing should work for the people who wear it rather than against them. Isabella asked thoughtful questions about his sketches, wanted to understand his thinking process, his approach to solving design problems. "I have to ask," she said toward the end of their conversation, "what made you apply for this position? It's quite a career change from construction work." Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I think I've always been interested in design, even when I was working in construction. Every building project is really a design problem, figuring out how to make spaces work for the people who will use them. Fashion seems similar to me, designing things that have to work for real people in real situations." Isabella nodded, making a note on the pad in front of her. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Too many designers forget that clothes have to be functional as well as beautiful, that the best design is invisible because it just works." As the interview concluded, Isabella walked Marcus to the elevator, making casual conversation about the building's progress and the challenges of moving a business from one coast to another. But as they waited for the elevator to arrive, she said something that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. "You know, I've been watching your work on this building for months. Your attention to detail, your problem-solving skills, the way you work with your team. It's exactly the kind of professionalism we want to bring to Avalon Studios." The elevator doors opened, and Marcus stepped inside, his mind racing. Had she really been watching him work? How long had she known about his interest in design? As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of her smile, and for a moment he could have sworn he'd seen that exact expression before, in a different context, under different circumstances. The call came 3 days later while Marcus was installing light fixtures on the building's top floor. Isabella Rivera's assistant offered him the position at a salary that was significantly higher than his construction wages, with benefits that included health insurance and even a small budget for continuing education. The job would start in 6 weeks, giving him time to finish his current project and help with the transition to Avalon Studios' new facilities. Marcus accepted immediately, then spent the rest of the day in a daze. He was going to be a designer, not an architect exactly, but someone who created things rather than just building them. It felt like a dream, the kind of opportunity he'd stopped believing could happen to someone like him. That evening, he sat Emma down for a serious conversation about the job change. He explained that it would mean different hours, possibly some travel, definitely a learning curve as he adapted to an entirely new industry. But Emma's reaction was even more enthusiastic than he'd hoped. "Does this mean you'll be famous?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Probably not," Marcus laughed. "But it means I'll be doing work that I really love, work that uses all the different skills I've learned over the years. And you'll still have time to help me with my homework." "Always," Marcus promised. "That's never going to change." As they celebrated with ice cream and a movie, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A simple act of kindness on a rainy day had somehow resulted in months of anonymous gifts, a stable job that had given him confidence to pursue his dreams, and now an opportunity that seemed almost too perfect to be real. He thought about Isabella Rivera, about the familiar quality of her smile and the way she'd mentioned watching his work. Could she be connected to the mysterious benefactor who'd been helping them all winter? The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. But Marcus couldn't figure out how a successful fashion designer from New York would have any reason to help a struggling construction worker in Seattle. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his sketchpad, trying to design something that might be worthy of Avalon Studios' reputation. But his mind kept wandering to that rainy day outside Pike Place. Market, to the woman in the cream-colored coat who'd accepted his windbreaker with such surprise and gratitude. He'd given away that jacket without a second thought, motivated by nothing more than basic human decency. But somehow, that simple gesture had set in motion a series of events that was transforming his life in ways he was still discovering. It was a reminder that kindness was never wasted, that even the smallest acts of generosity could create ripples that spread far beyond their original impact. As he worked on his sketch, Marcus began to understand something important about the path that had brought him to this moment. Success wasn't just about individual achievement or personal ambition. It was about recognizing the connections between people, the ways that helping others ultimately helped yourself, the truth that no one succeeded completely alone. The building he'd helped construct was nearly complete, and soon it would house a company that created beautiful things for people to wear and enjoy. He would be part of that creation, using skills he'd developed over years of practical work to solve new kinds of problems, to contribute to something larger than himself. Outside his apartment window, Seattle sparkled with the lights of thousands, of people pursuing their own dreams, facing their own challenges, making their own small contributions to the vast web of human connection and mutual support. Marcus Chen was one of them now, no longer struggling just to survive, but actively building something meaningful, something that would last beyond his own immediate needs. The fairy godmother, whoever she was, had given him more than gifts and opportunities. She had given him back his faith in possibility, his belief that tomorrow could be better than today. His understanding that the world was full of people willing to help if you were willing to accept that help with grace and pass it forward when you could. As he put away his sketchpad and prepared for bed, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude that went beyond any specific gift or opportunity. Someone had seen worth in him when he'd almost stopped seeing it in himself, had recognized potential he'd thought was lost forever, had invested in his future when he could barely imagine what that future might hold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. But tonight, Marcus Chen allowed himself to believe that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, part of a story that was still being written, but was already more beautiful than anything he could have imagined. The first day at Avalon Studios felt like stepping into a world Marcus had only imagined existed. The space that had been bare concrete and exposed wiring just weeks ago had been transformed into something that looked more like an art gallery than a workplace. Natural light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating workstations equipped with high-end sewing machines, cutting tables that seemed to stretch forever, and computer screens displaying fashion sketches in vivid detail. Marcus arrived early, dressed in the best clothes he owned, and carrying a leather portfolio that had been another mysterious gift, delivered just 3 days after he'd accepted the position. Inside were copies of his sketches, his construction, certifications, and a handwritten note from Emma that read, "Good luck at your new job, Daddy. I'm proud of you," in her careful third-grade handwriting. Isabella Rivera met him at the reception desk, looking perfectly put together despite the early hour. She wore a flowing jacket in deep navy that moved like water when she walked, paired with perfectly fitted trousers and shoes that were obviously handmade. But it was her expression that caught Marcus's attention, a warmth that seemed genuine rather than professional courtesy. "Welcome to Avalon," she said, extending her hand. "Ready for the grand tour?" The studio occupied 3 floors of the building Marcus had helped complete. The ground floor housed the main production area, where a team of skilled seamstresses worked at individual stations, each focused on different aspects of garment construction. The second floor was devoted to design and planning, with drafting, tables, computer stations, and a library of fabric samples that filled an entire wall. The third floor was Isabella's private office and a conference room where she met with clients and suppliers. What struck Marcus most was the atmosphere of quiet concentration. This wasn't a sweatshop or a factory floor, but something closer. To an artist's studio where each person was engaged in work that required both technical skill and creative vision. The employees he met seemed genuinely happy to be there, proud of what they were creating, invested in the success of the company as a whole. "We're not trying to compete with fast fashion," Isabella explained as they walked through the design floor. "Our clients want clothes that will last for years, pieces that become part of their personal style rather than something they'll throw away next season. That means every detail has to be perfect, from the initial concept to the final stitching." Marcus's role was more complex than he'd initially understood. As facilities and design coordinator, he would be responsible for maintaining the physical workspace, managing the technical systems that kept the studio running, and contributing to the design process when his construction background could add value. It was a unique position that seemed to have been created specifically for his combination of skills and experience. On his third day, Isabella asked him to join her for lunch at a small cafe near the studio. It was the kind of place that served organic salads and artisanal sandwiches, where the clientele looked like they worked in creative industries and had enough disposable income to spend $15 on soup. Marcus felt slightly out of place, but Isabella seemed completely comfortable, ordering for both of them and finding a quiet table by the window. "How are you settling in?" she asked once they'd been served. "I know it's quite a change from construction work." "It's different," Marcus admitted, "but good different. I'm learning a lot about how design actually works in practice, not just in theory." Isabella nodded, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "You know, when Tom Wilson first mentioned you, I wasn't sure if someone with your background would be interested in fashion design. But after I saw some of your sketches, I realized you understand something that a lot of trained designers miss." "What's that?" "That good design has to work in the real world. Clothes aren't art pieces hanging in a gallery. They're things people wear while they're living their lives. They have to be comfortable and durable and practical, not just beautiful." Marcus felt a flush of pride at her words. It was exactly what he'd been thinking, but hadn't been sure how to articulate. "I guess that comes from construction work. Buildings have to look good, but they also have to stand up and keep people safe." "Exactly," Isabella said, leaning forward slightly. "And that's why I think you're going to do very well here. You have an instinct for what works, not just what looks impressive." As they talked, Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. Isabella was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in his thoughts and opinions, willing to explain aspects of the fashion industry that were completely foreign to him. She asked about Emma, about his plans for the future, about his experience as a single father trying to balance work and family responsibilities. "It must be challenging," she said when he mentioned Emma's after-school care arrangements. "I imagine you don't have much time for yourself." "I don't really think about it that way," Marcus replied. "Emma's the most important thing in my life. Everything else is just details." Something flickered across Isabella's expression, an emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. She's lucky to have a father who feels that way. Not all children do. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience, but before Marcus could pursue the thought, Isabella was checking her watch and mentioning that they needed to get back to the studio for an afternoon meeting with suppliers. The weeks that followed established a routine that Marcus found both challenging and deeply satisfying. His days were spent solving problems that required both technical knowledge and creative thinking. When the cutting table's motor started, making strange noises, he diagnosed and repaired it himself rather than calling an expensive service technician. When Isabella wanted to redesign the lighting in the main production area, he researched different options and installed a system that provided better illumination while using less energy. But it was the design work that really captured his imagination. Isabella began including him in client consultations, asking for his input on technical aspects of garment construction and his perspective on how different designs might work for people with various body types and lifestyle needs. His construction background proved invaluable when working with clients who needed professional clothing that could withstand long days and frequent movement, or when designing pieces that had to incorporate specific functional elements. Emma was fascinated by his new career. She started sketching her own clothing designs, imagining outfits for her dolls and friends, asking Marcus endless questions about how fabric behaved and why certain construction techniques worked better than others. Isabella had given him several sample fabrics to take home, and Emma loved feeling the different textures and weights, trying to understand how each one might be used in different types of garments. "Maybe I'll be a fashion designer too," Emma announced one evening while they were working on homework together. "We could have a father-daughter company." "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Marcus said, touched by her enthusiasm, "though you might decide you want to do something completely different by the time you grow up." "Maybe," Emma conceded, "but I like making beautiful things, and I like that your job makes people happy when they wear the clothes you help design." It was true, Marcus realized. The clients who came to Avalon Studios weren't just buying clothes, they were investing in pieces that would make them feel confident and comfortable, that would become part of their professional and personal identities. There was something deeply satisfying about contributing to that process, about using his skills to create things that would improve people's daily lives in small but meaningful ways. The mystery of their anonymous benefactor had faded into the background as Marcus adjusted to his new life. The gifts had stopped coming once he started working at Avalon Studios, as if whoever had been helping them recognized that he no longer needed assistance. Marcus sometimes wondered about their fairy godmother, but he'd come to accept that some questions might never be answered. It was during his second month at the studio that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. He'd been working late, trying to finish a technical drawing for a client presentation when he realized he'd left his portfolio in Isabella's office after their afternoon meeting. The building was empty except for the security guard, and Marcus had his own key card, so he made his way up to the third floor to retrieve his materials. Isabella's office was dark, but the hallway lighting provided enough illumination for Marcus to locate his portfolio on the conference table. As he picked it up, something on Isabella's desk caught his eye. It was a photograph, clearly personal rather than professional, showing a young woman and a small girl. But it was the jacket the woman was wearing that made Marcus's heart stop. It was his old Navy windbreaker, the one he'd given away on that rainy day outside Pike Place Market, the one he'd never expected to see again. Marcus moved closer to the desk, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the photograph. The woman in the picture was definitely Isabella, though younger and dressed more casually than he'd ever seen her. She was smiling at the camera, one arm around the little girl, both of them standing in front of what looked like a college dormitory. But it was definitely his jacket she was wearing, the same faded color, the same missing button, the same small tear near the left pocket that he'd never bothered to repair. "Find what you were looking for?" Marcus spun around, nearly dropping. The photograph. Isabella stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She'd changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and more approachable. "I'm sorry," Marcus stammered, setting the photograph back on the desk. "I just came to get my portfolio and I saw this picture, and the jacket looked familiar." Isabella stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. She moved to her desk and picked up the photograph, studying it for a moment before looking back at Marcus. "It should look familiar," she said quietly. "It's yours." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Marcus was still trying to process. "You're the woman from Pike Place Market," he said, though it came out more as a question than a statement. "I am." Isabella set the photograph down and leaned against her desk. "Though I wasn't sure you'd recognize me, I looked pretty different that day." Marcus felt like the world had shifted slightly on its axis. "You've been the one sending the gifts, the groceries, the clothes for Emma, the art supplies. Among other things, yes." "But why?" Marcus asked, the question that had been haunting him for months finally finding voice. "I mean, I appreciated everything, but I don't understand why you would help us like that." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently straightening papers on her desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "Because someone helped me once, when I was about Emma's age, and because what you did that day reminded me that there are still people in the world who give without expecting anything in return." She moved to the window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled in the darkness below. "I was having the worst day of my life when you gave me your jacket. I'd just gotten out of a meeting with investors who decided not to fund my company. I'd been walking around in the rain for hours, trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and I was seriously considering giving up on everything I'd worked for." Marcus joined her at the window, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to hear her clearly. "What changed your mind?" "You did," Isabella said simply. "This complete stranger, who obviously had his own problems to worry about, gave me his jacket because I looked like I needed it more than he did. You didn't know who I was or whether I could help you in return. You just saw someone who was struggling and decided to do something about it." She turned to face him, and Marcus could see tears glittering in her eyes. "I went home that night and called my business partner in New York, told him we were going to find another way to fund the expansion, that I wasn't ready to give up yet. That jacket became my good luck charm, the reminder that there were still good people in the world worth working for." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the revelation. "So you decided to help us?" "I decided to pay attention," Isabella corrected. "I started asking around about you, found out about Emma, about your situation. When I learned you were working construction on the building I'd leased for the studio, it felt like fate. The job offer wasn't really about my qualifications, was it?" Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. "Oh, your qualifications are real. I wouldn't have hired you if you couldn't do the work. But yes, I created the position with you in mind. I wanted someone who understood both the technical and human sides of design, and you were the only person I'd ever met who had that combination of skills and character." Marcus walked back to the conference table and sank into one of the chairs, trying to process everything he'd learned. "I don't know what to say. Thank you seems inadequate." "You don't need to say anything," Isabella replied, taking the chair across from him. "You gave me something invaluable that day, something I didn't even know I needed. I just wanted to return the favor." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus looked up at Isabella and asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he'd seen the photograph. "What happens now? I mean, do things change between us, now that I know?" Isabella considered the question carefully. "I hope not," she said finally. "I'd like to think we can be colleagues, maybe even friends, without the mystery getting in the way, but that's up to you." Marcus thought about Emma, about the life they'd built over the past year, about the future he was beginning to envision for both of them. Isabella had given them more than material support. She'd given them hope and opportunity and the chance to dream again. But more than that, she'd shown him that kindness was never wasted, that simple acts of generosity could create connections that lasted far beyond their original moment. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it completely. "I think Emma would too. She's been curious about you ever since I started working here." "I'd love to meet her properly," Isabella said, her face lighting up. "Maybe you could both come to dinner. Sometime, I make a pretty decent lasagna, and I'd like to hear about her school projects and her own design ideas." As they prepared to leave the building together, Marcus felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. The mystery had been solved, but rather than ending the story, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Isabella wasn't just his employer or his anonymous benefactor. She was someone who had recognized something worthwhile in him when he'd almost stopped believing it existed. Walking out into the Seattle night, Marcus thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness had created a connection that had transformed both their lives, proving that generosity was never a one-way street, that helping others ultimately helped yourself in ways you could never predict or plan. Emma was going to be thrilled when he told her that the fairy godmother was real, that she had a name and a face and wanted to be part of their lives in a genuine way. But more than that, she was going to understand something important about how the world worked, about the invisible threads that connected people who chose to care for each other, about the truth that no one succeeded completely alone. As Marcus drove home through the quiet streets, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had seen worth in him when he'd barely seen it in himself, who had invested in his future when he could barely imagine what that future might hold. Isabella Rivera had given him more than a job or financial security. She'd given him back his faith in possibility, his belief that tomorrow could be better than today, his understanding that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. The rain that had brought them together that first day had washed away more than just the dirt from Seattle's streets. It had cleared the way for something new to grow, something neither of them could have planned or predicted, but both of them were grateful to have found. As Marcus pulled into his apartment building's parking lot, he was already planning how to tell Emma about their fairy godmother's true identity, about the job that had become a calling, about the future that was finally beginning to look as bright as the dreams they'd almost given up on. 6 months after the revelation in Isabella's office, Marcus Chen found himself standing in the same spot where his life had changed forever. Pike Place Market buzzed with its usual energy, tourists and locals weaving between vendor stalls while street musicians filled the air with melodies that competed with the calls of fishmongers and flower sellers. But this time, Marcus wasn't here because he was desperate or lost. He was here because he'd chosen to be, accompanying Isabella on a Saturday morning shopping trip that had become something of a tradition for them. Emma skipped ahead of them, her new camera capturing everything that caught her interest. At 9 years old, she'd developed an eye for composition that impressed even Isabella, who'd started teaching her the basics of visual design during their weekly dinner gatherings. The camera had been a birthday gift from Isabella, though she'd asked Marcus privately before giving it, respecting the boundaries they'd established around her role in Emma's life. "She's got real talent," Isabella said, watching Emma crouch down to photograph a display of colorful vegetables from an interesting angle. "Have you thought about photography classes for her?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own childhood dreams. and how they'd been put on hold by practical necessities. I want her to explore whatever interests her, but I also don't want to push too hard. She's still figuring out who she is. Smart approach, Isabella agreed, though I think she already knows more about herself than most adults do. It was true. Emma had blossomed over the past year in ways that went beyond just growing taller or getting better grades. She carried herself with a confidence that came from knowing she was valued and supported, that her opinions mattered and her dreams were valid. She spoke up in class now, volunteered for school presentations, and had even started a small club for kids interested in art and design. The three of them had fallen into an easy rhythm over the months since Marcus learned Isabella's true identity. She joined them for dinner twice a week, sometimes cooking elaborate meals in Marcus's small kitchen, other times bringing takeout from restaurants Emma had been curious to try. She attended Emma's school events when invited, helped with homework that required a female perspective, and slowly became the closest thing to extended family either of them had experienced in years. But it was more than just practical support. Isabella had brought a different energy to their household, a lightness that came from someone who'd found her own path through difficult circumstances and wanted to help others do the same. She laughed, easily told stories about her travels for business that made the world seem both larger and more accessible, and treated Emma like a complete person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Marcus had worried initially about how to navigate the relationship, whether Isabella's feelings for him went beyond gratitude and professional respect. But over time, it had become clear that what they'd built together was something more complex and valuable than simple romance. They were partners in a venture that went beyond Avalon Studios, collaborators in the project of creating a life that honored both practical needs and creative dreams. The business had thrived under their partnership. Marcus's ability to understand client needs from a functional perspective, combined with Isabella's artistic vision and business acumen, had created a reputation for designs that were both beautiful and remarkably practical. They'd expanded to include a line of children's clothing that Emma had helped inspire, garments designed to withstand active play while still looking polished enough for special occasions. "Dad, look at this!" Emma called from a nearby stall, where an elderly woman was selling hand-woven scarves. The patterns tell stories about where the wool came from and who made them. Marcus and Isabella joined her, listening as the vendor explained the traditional techniques she used and the significance of different color combinations. Emma asked thoughtful questions about the process, clearly fascinated by the connection between the maker's hands and the finished product. "It's like what you do at the studio," Emma told Isabella, "except instead of using machines, she's doing everything by hand." "That's exactly right," Isabella said, purchasing one of the scarves, despite Emma's protests that it was too expensive. Both approaches have value, but there's something special about work that carries the maker's personal touch. As they continued through the market, Marcus reflected on how much his understanding of work had evolved. Construction had taught him the satisfaction of building something that would last, but design work at Avalon Studios had shown him the joy of creating things that would become part of people's daily lives, that would make them feel more confident, or comfortable, or simply happier. The financial security was important, of course. Marcus no longer lay awake at night worrying about rent or groceries, and he'd been able to move them to a 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood with a small yard where Emma could play safely. But more than that, he'd found work that engaged all of his skills and interests, that challenged him to keep learning and growing rather than just performing familiar tasks. Isabella had been talking about expanding Avalon Studios again, possibly opening a second location or launching an online division that could reach customers across the country. She'd asked Marcus to consider taking on more responsibility, maybe even becoming a full partner in the business rather than just an employee. It was an opportunity he'd never imagined possible a year ago, the chance to have real ownership in something he was helping to build. "What do you think about the partnership?" "Idea?" Isabella asked as they sat at a small table outside a coffee shop, watching Emma feed pieces of her muffin to the pigeons that had gathered hopefully nearby. Marcus had been considering the question for weeks, weighing the opportunities against the risks, thinking about what it would mean for Emma's future as well as his own. "I think I'd like to try it," he said finally, "but I want to make sure I can handle the extra responsibility without shortchanging Emma." "We'll figure it out together," Isabella said. "That's what partners do." The word partners carried a weight that went beyond business arrangements. Over the months, Marcus had come to understand that Isabella saw their relationship as something built to last, a mutual investment in each other's success and happiness that transcended simple friendship or professional collaboration. She'd become family in the way that mattered most, not through blood or legal documents, but through choice and commitment and daily acts of care. Emma had been the first to recognize what was happening between the adults in her life. "Are you and Isabella going to get married?" she'd asked one evening after Isabella had left following one of their regular dinners. "What makes you ask that?" Marcus had replied, curious about her perspective. "You act like married people do on TV," Emma had said matter-of-factly. "You make decisions together and worry about each other and laugh at each other's jokes even when they're not that funny." Marcus had considered her observation carefully. "Would it bother you if we did get married someday?" Emma had thought about it seriously as she approached most important questions. "I think it would be nice," she'd said finally. "Isabella makes you happy, and she makes me feel like I have a mom again, kind of. Plus she's really good at braiding hair, which you definitely are not." The conversation had stayed with Marcus as he and Isabella grew closer, as their relationship evolved from professional collaboration to something more personal and intimate. They'd been taking things slowly, partly because they both understood the stakes involved, partly because what they were building felt too valuable to risk rushing or forcing. But lately, Marcus had begun to think about forever in ways he hadn't since Sarah died. Not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as something entirely new, built on different foundations but equally solid. Isabella understood his love for Emma, respected the bond between father and daughter, and had found ways to become part of their family unit without trying to change its essential character. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Isabella said, interrupting his thoughts. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it on the table between them. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "Isabella." "It's not what you think," she said quickly, then smiled. "Well, it is, but not exactly." She opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "This was my grandmother's ring. She gave it to me before she died. Told me to save it for someone who understood that love was about choosing each other every day, not just in the dramatic moments." Emma had noticed the box and wandered back to their table, her eyes wide with excitement. "Is that an engagement ring?" "It could be," Isabella said, looking at Marcus rather than Emma. "If your dad thinks he's ready to officially make me part of this family." Marcus looked at the ring, then at Isabella's face, then at Emma's hopeful expression. A year ago, he'd been a single father struggling to keep his head above water, focused entirely on survival and basic stability. Now, he was being offered a partnership in a thriving business and a place in a real family unit, built around mutual support and genuine affection. "I think I'm ready," he said, reaching for the ring. "But shouldn't I be the one asking you?" Isabella laughed, the sound bright and happy in the afternoon air. "We've never done anything the traditional way. Why start now?" Emma clapped her hands as Marcus slipped the ring onto Isabella's finger, then immediately demanded to examine it more closely. "Does this mean I can call you Mom?" she asked Isabella. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," Isabella replied, hugging Emma close, "but I'd be honored if you wanted to call me Mom." As they walked back through Pike Place Market toward the car, Marcus thought about the circle his life had made. He'd given away a jacket on this same corner out of simple human kindness, never imagining that the gesture would eventually lead to a new career, a stable income, and a family that was larger and stronger than anything he'd dared to hope. For the market was beginning to wind down for the day, vendors packing up their displays and counting their earnings. But the energy remained, the sense of connection between people who'd chosen to spend their Saturday supporting local businesses and craftspeople, creating the kind of community that made cities feel like home rather than just places to live. Emma ran ahead again, her camera capturing the late afternoon light as it slanted through the market's windows. She'd already announced plans to create a photo album documenting their regular visits, a visual diary of how their family had grown and changed over the past year. Marcus loved her instinct for preserving important moments, her understanding that happiness was worth remembering and celebrating. "You know what I realized today," Isabella said, linking her arm through Marcus's as they walked. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about that day when you gave me your jacket as the moment my luck changed, but I think I had it backwards. It wasn't about luck at all. It was about recognizing goodness when I saw it and deciding to invest in it." Marcus considered her words as they reached the car. "So what happens now? Do we live happily ever after?" Isabella smiled as she helped Emma into the back seat. "We live happily right now, and we work to make sure tomorrow is even better. That's the only kind of forever that really matters." The drive home took them through neighborhoods Marcus had driven through countless times over the past year. But everything looked different now, not because the buildings or streets had changed, but because he was seeing them through the eyes of someone who belonged, someone who had a stake in the community's future and the resources to contribute to its growth. At Emma's request, they stopped at the grocery store to buy ingredients for a celebration dinner. She wanted to cook something special to mark their engagement, though her idea of special cooking involved a lot of input from both adults and several backup plans, in case her ambitious menu proved too complicated. As they moved through the store together, Marcus was struck by how ordinary and extraordinary the moment felt. Just 3 people buying groceries for dinner, planning an evening at home, making the small decisions that added up to a life. But it was also a family, forming itself through choice and commitment. 3 people who'd found each other through circumstances none of them could have predicted or planned. Emma insisted on pushing the shopping cart, steering it with the kind of determination that suggested she took her new responsibilities as part of an expanded family unit seriously. She consulted with both adults about every purchase, comparing prices and nutritional information with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned early that resources were precious and decisions mattered. "Can we get the fancy ice cream?" she asked as they reached the frozen food section. "For dessert after our engagement dinner?" "Absolutely," Marcus said, reaching for the most expensive flavor in the case. "This is definitely a fancy ice cream kind of night." Back at their apartment, Emma took charge of the kitchen with the kind of authority that made both adults exchange amused glances. She'd been planning the menu for days, apparently, and she had very specific ideas about how everything should be prepared and presented. Marcus and Isabella found themselves relegated to sous chef positions, chopping vegetables and following instructions with mock seriousness. "You know," Isabella said quietly as they worked, "I used to wonder what it would be like to have a family. I'd given up on the idea by the time I met you." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked, though. He suspected he knew the answer. Isabella gestured toward Emma, who was carefully arranging place settings with the concentration of a professional event planner. She did, and you did. You showed me that families aren't just about blood relationships or traditional structures. They're about people who choose to take care of each other, who show up consistently, who create something together that's bigger than any of them could manage alone. Dinner was both chaotic and perfect, with Emma's ambitious recipes requiring several course corrections and some creative problem-solving from the adults. But the food was secondary to the conversation, the laughter, the sense of celebration that filled their small dining room. Emma presented them with a handmade card she'd been working on secretly, featuring a drawing of 3 figures holding hands under a rainbow with "Our New Family" written in her careful script. Later, after Emma had gone to bed clutching the fancy ice cream container like a prize, Marcus and Isabella sat on the couch making plans for their future. The wedding would be small and simple, they decided, focused on the commitment rather than the ceremony. Emma would help plan it, of course, and she'd have an official role in the proceedings, symbolizing the truth that this marriage was creating a family unit rather than just joining 2 individuals. The business partnership would require lawyers and paperwork, but the emotional partnership was already solid, built on months of working together and making decisions that affected all 3 of their lives. They talked about expanding Avalon Studios, about maybe buying a house with a real yard, where Emma could have a garden and Isabella could set up a proper home office. "Are you sure about all this?" Isabella asked as the evening wound down. "It's a lot of change happening very fast." Marcus thought about the question seriously. Change had often meant instability in his life, disruption of carefully maintained routines that kept him and Emma safe and secure. But this change felt different, like evolution rather than revolution, the natural progression of something that had been growing steadily for months. "I'm sure," he said, pulling her closer on the couch. "For the first time in years, I'm completely sure about something." Outside their apartment window, Seattle sparkled with the lights of thousands of people pursuing their own versions of happiness and success. Some of them were struggling as Marcus had struggled, wondering if tomorrow would be better than today, hoping for opportunities that seemed impossibly out of reach. Others were thriving, building businesses and families and dreams that would create ripples of possibility for people they might never meet. Marcus Chen was moving from the first category to the second, carrying with him the lessons he'd learned during the difficult years, the understanding that success meant more than just personal achievement. It meant creating something that would last beyond your own immediate needs, something that would make the world a little better for the people who came after you. The ring on Isabella's finger caught the light from the lamp beside them, a symbol of promises made and kept, of faith in a future that was bright enough to be worth working toward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, the daily work of building a business and a family and a life that honored both practical needs and impossible dreams. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to believe that he had everything he needed to meet those challenges successfully. He had work that engaged all of his skills and interests, a daughter who was growing into someone he was proud to know, and a partner who understood that the best kind of love was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. The fairy tale was ending, but the real story was just beginning. Marcus Chen had learned that kindness was never wasted, that simple acts of generosity could create connections that lasted far beyond their original moment, that sometimes the most ordinary gestures could transform lives in ways no one could predict or plan. As he and Isabella sat together in the quiet contentment of their small apartment, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, with Emma beside them and the whole future spread out before them like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. 2 years after their quiet wedding ceremony in the backyard of their new Bellevue home, Marcus Chen stood in the main showroom of Avalon Studios' second location, watching Emma demonstrate the prototype of a new children's clothing line to a group of potential investors. At 11 years old, she moved through the presentation with the poise of someone who'd grown up understanding that good ideas were worth sharing, and that confidence came from knowing your subject matter inside and out. The pockets are positioned here and here, Emma explained, pointing to strategic locations on the sample garments, because kids need places to keep their treasures, but they also need to be able to move freely without things falling out when they're playing. She held up a small jacket designed for active outdoor wear. And see how the zipper has this extra piece of fabric. That prevents pinching, which is something most adult designers don't think about because they forget what it's like to be small. The investors nodded approvingly, scribbling notes and asking follow-up questions that Emma answered with the kind of technical knowledge that impressed even Marcus. She'd been working on this project for months, combining her own experiences as a kid who spent a lot of time outdoors with observations from her friends and classmates about what worked and what didn't in their existing wardrobes. Isabella stood at the back of the room, beaming with pride as Emma fielded questions about fabric durability and cost-effectiveness. The children's line had been Emma's idea originally, born from her frustration with clothes that looked good but fell apart after a few weeks of normal wear, or that were built to last but made kids look like tiny adults, rather than allowing them to express their own sense of style. Marcus had been skeptical initially about involving Emma so directly in the business. She was still a child, and he wanted her to have a normal childhood rather than feeling pressure to contribute to the family income or prove herself in adult professional settings. But Isabella had argued that Emma's insights were genuinely valuable, that she understood the target market in ways that adult designers couldn't replicate, and that including her in age-appropriate ways would teach her lessons about entrepreneurship and creative collaboration that no classroom could provide. The compromise they'd reached allowed Emma to contribute her ideas and participate in design discussions while making it clear that school remained her primary responsibility, and that she could step back from the business involvement anytime she wanted to focus on other interests. So far, she'd shown no signs of losing enthusiasm for the work, though she'd also developed passions for photography, environmental science, and competitive swimming that kept her schedule full and varied. Any final questions for our junior consultant? Isabella asked the investors, using the official title they'd created for Emma's role in the company. A woman in an expensive suit raised her hand. Emma, what would you say to other kids who have ideas for products but don't think adults will take them seriously? Emma considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had become her trademark approach to difficult topics. I'd say that good ideas come from understanding real problems, and kids understand some problems better than adults do because we're the ones experiencing them. But I'd also say that you need to do your homework and be able to explain not just what you want to create, but why it would work and who would want to buy it. She paused, glancing at Marcus and Isabella before continuing. And I'd say that you need to find adults who are willing to listen and help you turn ideas into real things. I'm really lucky because my parents believe that kids can have smart ideas, and they've taught me how to present them in ways that other adults can understand. The presentation concluded with enthusiastic applause and several immediate commitments to fund the children's line expansion. As the investors filed out, making appointments for follow-up meetings and requesting samples to share with their retail contacts, Marcus felt a familiar sense of amazement at how much his life had changed and how naturally Emma had adapted to circumstances he could never have imagined when she was younger. "You did great up there," he told her as they packed up the presentation materials. "I'm proud of how you handled those questions about manufacturing costs. That's complicated stuff." Emma shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up around business discussions and had absorbed complex concepts gradually rather than all at once. "Isabella explained it to me last week, using the example of making cookies. If you want to make a lot of cookies that all taste the same, you need special equipment and ingredients that work consistently. But if you're just making cookies for your family, you can use whatever you have in the kitchen." Isabella laughed from across the room, where she was organizing contact information for the new investors. "That's not exactly how I explained economy of scale, but it's not wrong either." The three of them had developed an easy working relationship that balanced Emma's involvement in the business with clear boundaries around her age and developmental needs. She participated in design meetings and product testing, contributed ideas for marketing and customer outreach, and had even traveled with Marcus and Isabella to trade shows where her perspective on children's clothing needs provided valuable insights for retail buyers. But she was also still very much a kid who did homework at the kitchen table, complained about chores, and spent weekend afternoons building elaborate forts in the backyard with her friends. The business involvement was part of her life, not the center of it, and both Marcus and Isabella worked hard to maintain that balance. "Are we still going to the Mariners game tonight?" Emma asked as they locked up the showroom and headed for the parking garage. "Because I promised Connor I'd bring him a program, and I don't want to disappoint him." Connor was Emma's newest friend, a boy from her swimming team whose family had recently moved to Seattle from Chicago. His father worked construction, and his mother was a nurse, and they were still adjusting to the higher cost of living in their new city. Emma had mentioned that Connor's family was struggling financially, and she'd been finding subtle ways to include him in activities and share resources without making it seem like charity. Marcus recognized the impulse. Emma had inherited his instinct for helping people who needed support, but she'd learned to do it with more grace and discretion than he'd managed when he was younger. She invited Connor over for dinner regularly, always asked if he could join them for outings like baseball games or movies, and had even convinced Isabella to hire his mother for some part-time administrative work at Avalon Studios. "We're definitely still going," Marcus assured her. "I already have the programs you wanted, plus an extra one for Connor's little sister." The drive home took them through neighborhoods that had become familiar territory over the past 2 years. They'd chosen Bellevue for the school district and the space for Emma to have her own room and bathroom, but also for the community feel that reminded Marcus of what he'd imagined suburban family life might be like when he was growing up in Seattle's urban core. Their house was a modest split level with a large backyard that Isabella had converted into a combination vegetable garden and outdoor workspace where she could experiment with natural fabric dyes and sustainable textile techniques. Emma had claimed a corner of the garden for her own projects, currently featuring an ambitious attempt to grow cotton plants that she planned to harvest and spin into thread using a wheel she'd built with Marcus's help. "Dad, can we talk about something serious before we go to the game?" Emma asked as they pulled into the driveway. Marcus felt the familiar flutter of parental anxiety that came whenever his daughter announced serious conversation topics. At 11, Emma's version of serious could range from questions about global politics to concerns about whether her goldfish was getting adequate nutrition. Of course. "What's on your mind?" Emma waited until they were settled in the living room, Isabella curled up in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, and Marcus on the couch with Emma beside him. "I've been thinking about Connor's family and how they're having money troubles like we used to have. And I was wondering if there's a way we could help them without making them feel bad about it." Isabella and Marcus exchanged glances over Emma's head. This was the kind of conversation they'd been expecting as Emma grew older, and began to understand more about their family's history and current circumstances. She knew they'd struggled financially before Isabella came into their lives, though. They'd tried to shield her from the worst of the anxiety and uncertainty. "What kind of help were you thinking about?" Isabella asked gently. "Well, Connor's mom is really good at organizing things and keeping track of details," Emma said. "And you're always saying how much paperwork you have to do for the business, that you don't really enjoy. Maybe she could help with more of that stuff, like enough hours that it would make a real difference for their family budget." Marcus felt a surge of pride at his daughter's thoughtfulness. "That's a really good idea. But you know that kind of decision has to come from Isabella as the business owner, right? We can't just create jobs for people because we want to help them." "I know," Emma said. "But Connor's mom is really qualified for that kind of work. And Isabella always says that the best business decisions help everybody involved. So if she's good at the job and it helps the company run better, then everybody wins." Isabella set down her teacup and leaned forward. "You know what, Emma? I think you're right. I've been thinking about hiring someone to handle more of the administrative work so I can focus on design and business development. Connor's mom might be perfect for that position." They talked through the logistics of expanding the administrative support at Avalon Studios, with Emma contributing insights about Connor's mother's background and personality that helped Isabella understand what kind of role might work best. It was the type of family problem-solving session that had become common in their household, where business decisions were made with consideration for their impact on the community and where Emma's perspective was valued alongside the adults' experience. Later that evening, as they settled into their seats at Safeco Field with hot dogs and peanuts, Marcus reflected on how seamlessly Emma had grown into her role as both a kid and a contributing member of their family business. She cheered enthusiastically for the Mariners, collected autographs from players during batting practice, and spent innings between the action-sketching design ideas for baseball-themed children's clothing in the margins of her program. "You know what I love about this," Isabella said during the seventh inning stretch, gesturing toward Emma, who was explaining the finer points of baseball strategy to an elderly couple sitting nearby. "What's that?" "She's completely herself in every situation. She's not trying to be more adult than she is, but she's also not pretending to be less capable than she is. She just shows up as Emma, and people respond to that authenticity." Marcus watched his daughter demonstrate the proper technique for keeping score to her new friends, using the same patient teaching approach she'd developed for explaining design concepts to investors. "I think that comes from knowing she's valued for who she is, not just what she can contribute or achieve. And from having parents who model that same authenticity," Isabella added. "You've never pretended to be someone you're not, even when it might have been easier or more profitable to put on an act." The observation made Marcus think about the path that had brought them to this moment. He'd started as a construction worker, doing his best to provide for his daughter, had been given opportunities he'd never expected, and had chosen at each step to remain true to his values and priorities, even when other approaches might have led to faster success or higher profits. The business partnership with Isabella had been built on that foundation of authenticity and mutual respect. They made decisions together, supported each other's strengths, and compensated for each other's weaknesses without trying to change the fundamental nature of who they were as individuals. Emma had grown up watching that dynamic, learning that successful relationships were built on accepting people as they were, while encouraging them to become the best version of themselves. As the game entered extra innings, Emma convinced the elderly couple to join them for ice cream, chatting easily with them about their grandchildren and their own memories of attending baseball games decades earlier. Marcus watched her navigate, The conversation with genuine interest in their stories, asking follow-up questions and finding connections between their experiences and her own life. "She's going to change the world," Isabella murmured, echoing something she'd said many times over the past 2 years. "She already is," Marcus replied, "one conversation at a time." The Mariners won in the 11th inning, and the crowd erupted in celebration that lasted long after the final out. Emma hugged her new elderly friends goodbye, promising to send them photos of her baseball-themed clothing designs when she finished them, and collected contact information so they could stay in touch about future games. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, still clutching her scorecard and the extra programs she'd collected for Connor and his sister. Isabella reached over to take Marcus's hand as they navigated the late-night traffic, both of them tired but satisfied with the day's combination of business success and family time. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't given me your jacket that day?" Isabella asked quietly. Marcus considered the question as he had many times over the past few years. "I think we both would have found our way eventually, but it might have taken longer and been a lot more difficult. The timing was perfect, even though neither of us knew it at the time. I used to think success was about individual achievement," Isabella said. "Building something impressive that proved I was capable and smart and worth taking seriously. But watching Emma grow up, seeing how you parent her, being part of this family, I've learned that real success is about creating something that lifts other people up too." The insight reflected changes in all their lives over the past 2 years. Avalon Studios had grown into a company known not just for high-quality design and ethical manufacturing practices, but for its commitment to supporting employees and contributing to the local community. They'd established scholarship programs for kids interested in design and engineering, partnered with local schools to provide internship opportunities for students, and made hiring decisions that prioritized character and potential over just technical qualifications. Emma had been instrumental in many of these initiatives, bringing perspectives and suggestions that helped the adults understand how to make their efforts more effective and meaningful. Her involvement had taught Marcus and Isabella that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, that including different voices in decision-making processes led to better outcomes for everyone involved. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus looked at the house they'd made into a home, with Isabella's garden thriving in the backyard and Emma's artwork displayed proudly on the refrigerator. The mortgage was manageable, the utility bills were paid on time, and there was money in savings for emergencies and opportunities. But more than financial security, they'd built something that felt sustainable and meaningful, a life that honored both practical necessities and impossible dreams. Emma stirred as Marcus carried her inside, mumbling something about needing to finish her math homework before school tomorrow. She was growing fast, already showing signs of the teenager she'd become in a few years. But she was still young enough to fall asleep in the car after a long day and trust her parents to get her safely home. "Good night, sweetheart," Marcus whispered as he tucked her into bed. "Sweet dreams." "Dad?" Emma's voice was sleepy but clear. "Are you happy? Like, really happy, not just pretending for my sake?" The question caught Marcus off guard with its directness and insight. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm really happy. Are you?" "Yeah," Emma said, snuggling deeper into her pillow. "I like our life. I like that we help people and that people help us and that we're all together." After Emma was asleep, Marcus and Isabella sat on their back porch with glasses of wine, looking out at the garden and the city lights beyond. The evening was warm enough that they could hear neighbors' conversations drifting over fences, children playing in nearby yards, the distant hum of traffic on the highway that connected their suburban community to the urban center where they worked. "What do you think Emma will choose to do when she grows up?" Isabella asked, Will she stay involved with the business, or will she decide to do something completely different? Marcus thought about his daughter's various interests and talents, her passion for solving problems and her instinct for helping others. I think she'll do whatever allows her to make the biggest positive impact, whether that's fashion design or environmental science or something we haven't even thought of yet. And you're okay with that? Even if it means she doesn't want to take over Avalon Studios someday? I want her to have choices, Marcus said. Real choices, not just the illusion of choice. If the business is successful enough to provide her with options rather than obligations, then we've done our job as parents and as business owners. They talked about expansion plans for Avalon Studios, about Emma's upcoming school projects, about the vacation they were planning for later that summer. But underneath the practical conversations was a deeper satisfaction with the life they'd built together, the recognition that they'd managed to create something that was both stable and dynamic, rooted in shared values, but flexible enough to adapt as circumstances changed. The construction worker who had given his jacket to a stranger in the rain had become a successful business owner and devoted family man. The fashion designer who had nearly given up on her dreams had built a company that balanced profit with purpose. The little girl who had grown up in uncertainty had become a confident young person with the skills and support system to pursue whatever future she chose to create. But more than individual success stories, they'd become part of something larger, a network of relationships and mutual support that extended far beyond their immediate family. Employees at Avalon Studios, friends in their neighborhood, Emma's classmates and teachers, Connor's family, and dozens of others who had been touched by their willingness to help and include and invest in other people's potential. As they prepared for bed, Marcus found Emma's latest sketchbook open on the kitchen counter. The page showed a detailed drawing of their house with all three of them standing in the front yard, surrounded by friends and neighbors, and extended family that included not just blood relatives, but the chosen family they'd created through years of showing up for each other consistently and reliably. At the bottom of the page, Emma had written in her careful handwriting, "Home is where people choose to love each other every day, not just when it's easy or convenient." Marcus showed the drawing to Isabella, who smiled as she read Emma's words. "She really does understand what we've built here, doesn't she?" "She understands it because she helped build it," Marcus replied. "This isn't something we created for her. It's something we created with her, all of us together." Outside their bedroom window, Seattle sparkled with the dreams and ambitions of hundreds of thousands of people, each pursuing their own version of success and happiness. Some of them were struggling as Marcus had struggled, wondering if tomorrow would be better than today, hoping for opportunities that seemed impossibly out of reach. Others were thriving, building businesses and families and communities that would create ripples of possibility for people they might never meet. Marcus Chen had moved definitively from the first category to the second, but he'd never forgotten what it felt like to need help, to doubt whether he was capable of providing the kind of life his daughter deserved, to wonder if kindness and hard work were really enough to overcome the obstacles that seemed to multiply faster than he could address them. The jacket he'd given away that rainy day had been threadbare and worn, hardly valuable in any material sense. But it had carried with it something far more precious, the message that human beings were worth caring about, that simple acts of generosity could create connections that lasted far beyond their original moment, that the world was full of people willing to help if you were willing to accept that help with grace and pass it forward when you could. As Marcus fell asleep beside Isabella, with Emma safe in her own room and the future bright with possibility, he thought about all the jackets that were being given away that very night, all the small kindnesses that were planting seeds for transformations no one could predict or plan. Somewhere in the city, someone was making a choice to help a stranger, creating the first link in a chain of connection and mutual support that might change lives in ways they would never know. The story that had begun with a simple act of compassion on a rainy street corner had become something larger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. But it wasn't ending. It was just beginning the next chapter, spreading outward through Emma's generation and beyond, carried forward by everyone who had learned that the best kind of success was the kind that lifted others up alongside yourself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.